Hello and welcome back to UnHerd. It is the picture that everyone is talking about. Quite understandably, it is on pretty much every front page here in the UK. It is Elon Musk with his arm around, on the one side, Nigel Farage, the leader of Reform UK, who was making a visit to his friend Donald Trump over in Mar-a-Lago. And on the other side, it is the property developer and billionaire Nick Canby and recently announced Reform UK treasurer. They have been meeting Elon Musk. Over and above them, resplendent and framed in gold, is none other than Donald Trump with a quite flattering portrait. And recently, in the hours after that, Elon himself has been tweeting saying, yes, absolutely, the UK needs reform. He appears to give it a full endorsement. And if Mr. Farage is to be believed on this point, and I wouldn't doubt it, they were even discussing an actual donation that Elon might make to Reform UK. So is this a huge change moment? Is this suddenly turbocharging the chances of Reform UK? It certainly seems significant, and I think we need to get to the bottom of it. We've brought Tom McTague into the studio, our very own political editor, someone who is very familiar with Nigel. You've interviewed him before. Is this a huge seismic moment, or are we getting overexcited?
This episode is sponsored by Lumen. Lumen is the world's first handheld metabolic coach. It's a device that measures your metabolism through your breath. And on the app, it lets you know if you're burning fat or carbs and gives you tailored guidance to improve your nutrition, workout, sleep, and even stress management. All you have to do is breathe into your Lumen first thing in the morning, and you'll know what's going on with your metabolism. Lumen will tell you if you're burning mostly fat or carbs. Then, Lumen gives you a personalized nutrition plan for that day based on your measurements. You can also breathe into it before and after workouts and meals, so you know exactly what's going on in your body in real time. And Lumen will give you tips to keep you on top of your health game. It can also track your cycle as well as the onset of menopause and adjust your recommendations to keep your metabolism healthy throughout the hormonal shifts, so you can keep up your energy and starve off cravings. So if you want to take the next step in improving your health, go to lumen.me/unheard to get 15% off your Lumen. That is lumen.me/unheard for 15% off your purchase.
I think it's a very significant moment, whether it's seismic or not, I'm not sure. I think the fundamental reason why it's important is that Reform are already at a point in the polls where they are just a few points behind the Conservative Party. There is already talk that they will overtake the Conservative Party. Now that is a seismic moment because at some point you become the largest party on the centre-right or on the right. You become the place where voters will turn to on the right if they want to kick out the Labour Party. So if you reach that point, you reach a tipping point, particularly in our electoral system, where it makes sense then to start voting for Reform rather than the Conservative Party. Once the Conservative Party has lost that position as the main home for Conservative voters, then perhaps it enters a terminal decline. So the reason that Musk becomes important, I think, is two reasons. One is the feeling of the moment, the zeitgeist. Trump represents that. He's kind of captured that. Now, over in the UK, we have Nigel Farage, who is seemingly starting to capture that same sense of being the main insurgent force in British politics. And then there's just the fundamentals of politics, the money, the organisational structure. For so long, Reform has been a one-party band. Nigel Farage is Reform, and Reform is Nigel Farage. What is happening is that they are starting to create an organisational structure around the country. They are becoming much more like a real political party. And at the same time, the Conservative Party is running out of money. So if you add all of that together, this could be a significant moment.
It feels also like a different tone has been used when talking about Nigel Farage since the Trump victory. I don't know if you noticed that, but although people say, well, what has America got to do with the UK? Nigel Farage is supposed to be a localist, a populist, a nationalist. Why is he so interested in America and all of that? The reality is that Trump is all over every front page all the time. And the fact that he has been doing so well, had this huge victory, and now has around him all of these characters like Elon Musk who seem to be favouring Farage, somehow it makes a difference, doesn't it? It changes his position from being this sort of unlikely outsider to someone who seems to have quite a lot of momentum and support behind him.
Yeah, if you cast your mind back to the first Trump victory in 2016, it feels very different to today. Today feels much more substantial, not just because of Elon Musk, but I think that helps, but because more work has been done on what Trumpism means. But also it strikes me that something has changed in the public's perceptions of Trump. Whereas before you had a kind of moral revulsion on the left to Trump, now you get this sense that they're saying he won't actually be able to do it. He won't be able to build the border wall, or he won't be able to put up tariffs in such a way to protect or grow the American economy without causing inflation. They're practical critiques. They're not moral critiques of Trump. That's shifted. And I think you get that sense of it shifting here as well, people's reaction to the fact that Trump has won. It's not one of outrage and a sense that we must somehow resist it because normality will resume. There is almost an acceptance, this is normality now. Trumpism has won. It has won on some of the key arguments. And therefore, it legitimizes Nigel Farage himself, I think, in a way that wasn't the case before.
The fact that this Trump victory has happened in the US, in many people's heads will be analysed like a kind of presaging something that might happen here. And if that's right, if there is this global move to the right, and the kinds of arguments that both Farage and Trump are talking about are winning with voters, I think that the British political scene now looks at Farage as much more of a sort of, perhaps an inevitability.
Yeah, I think there is that sense of giving a movement some kind of meaning, in the same way that you had Reagan and Thatcher coming to power at roughly the same time with roughly the same goals, roughly the same sort of moral mission in the world. You had Tony Blair and Bill Clinton coming to power at the same time with the same goals and the same moral mission. That has been lost. For a while we had Boris Johnson and Donald Trump, but actually that was quite shallow when it was actually put to the test. Boris Johnson wasn't Donald Trump. For as much as he was painted as a Donald Trump, he wasn't. His instincts were completely different.
Why wasn't Boris like Trump?
Well, in one sense, let's see their instincts on Ukraine, for example. I mean, Boris Johnson has a conventional policy towards Ukraine. He would be on the sort of maximalist Republican establishment position, the McCain, Romney position. That is Boris Johnson's. Boris Johnson was once an amnesty for illegal immigrants guy. He was the prime minister who oversaw the Boris wave that is now called, liberalized immigration laws so that they have reached the levels that they are today. But also he's instinctively liberal. He's instinctively, in a small sense, socially. He's also, I think, kind of intellectually snobbish as well, in a way that Donald Trump isn't, Nigel Farage isn't. Boris Johnson's character as the kind of man of the people, he's not a man that you would, that he actually enjoys hanging around with other people. He would probably loathe being in Mar-a-Lago, in that sort of restaurant that exists there, in a way that Farage, I think, would really enjoy it. Boris Johnson's a bit of a loner. He likes to go off and read.
Although he liked to be liked, Boris Johnson, didn't he? And maybe that's the key difference, that he fundamentally, when the hard decisions came, chose the course that would give him a more acceptable route into kind of polite society. He was mayor of London. Metropolitan received opinion is something that he cares about. That is not true of either Donald Trump or Nigel Farage. So, let's ask the opposite question then, which is Farage like Trump? Because a lot of people are saying, maybe it's a mismatch. Maybe this is it's a mistake to read across and think, oh, okay, Farage is the British Donald Trump. Make the case for us, is he?
I think he is. So just building on what you've just said there, in a sense, Boris Johnson understands exactly what the establishment opinion is and then rebels against it within the establishment, within Eton or within Oxford or within The Spectator or Westminster. He has been in these establishment clubs his entire life and knows how to rise to the top. Nigel Farage didn't go to university. He went to a public school, but then didn't go to university. He made it in the city, and then joined politics quite early on, really, and has learned his craft. But it comes from challenging the establishment. There is a disreputability about Nigel Farage that there wasn't quite with Boris Johnson, in the same way that there is with Donald Trump. He's got that sense of what he is free in the way he expresses himself, which is similar, I think, to Donald Trump, which works on social media. And that was the other thing that always struck me. Boris Johnson was never very good on social media. He was never a prolific tweeter or short videos on TikTok. He was kind of rambling, long performances, which he was the center of attention. Farage is excellent on social media, always has been. He really broke through using YouTube in his days in the European Parliament. That's how he became a household name. He's learnt the art of modern media.
And that he does have in common with Donald Trump.
Absolutely.
I mean, I've seen a chart recently comparing Reform UK's social media presence on platforms like TikTok with the other parties. And I mean, they're just streets ahead.
Streets ahead, yeah.
And actually, you could make the case even that Farage and Trump are they both have a sort of boomerish, slightly older, affable, almost like the people they're surrounded with, these tech bros and these more ideological people, are almost harder edged and slightly different from the main characters themselves, who are these slightly retro guys down the pub, or guy you remember from your TV in the 1980s in the case of Trump. Do you think that's a comparison? That they're almost reassuringly retro?
Yeah, golf club Tories, right? That's probably because Donald Trump doesn't drink. Nigel Farage is the man with a pint in his hand at all times, who loved to drink, and I think that was kind of genuinely loved to drink. Whereas Boris Johnson's was like a quiet, I'll have a glass of wine by myself. He doesn't drink beer down a pub with anybody. But it's this sense of, you understand these characters, who they are. Everybody knows a Nigel Farage character because they're everywhere. The country is full of people who talk and sound and think like Nigel Farage, just as the same is true in the United States. I mean, in one sense, Trump has shown himself to have a far more ruthless will to power than Nigel Farage. And Donald Trump, when he went for it, went and claimed the Republican nomination, which is the route to the presidency. Nigel Farage has worked a much lonelier kind of path, or he had trotted a much lonelier path on his route to the position he is in today. He has lost multiple times trying to get into Parliament. He has not sort of stuck it out in the Conservative Party. So there is perhaps a difference there, and we don't yet know how strong his will to power is. Will he do everything necessary to claim the premiership? We don't know, but I think it is interesting. He's started to moderate his language over recent months, particularly on immigration. And there is this sense that actually he is starting to think this might be possible. And therefore, what I need to do is to make it more respectable to vote for Nigel Farage.
Yeah, and he's actually getting criticised for that from within his own side. I mean, I see this a lot on social media. People who are theoretically Reform supporters, kind of right-wing of the Conservative Party, criticising Nigel Farage for not being hardcore enough. Things he says about ruling out remigration, which is the word people use for repatriation of immigrants. He's basically said he's not interested in that as a concept. Have you observed that he's sort of almost being outflanked by his own party?
Well, even perhaps during the Conservative Party leadership, you could argue that he was getting outflanked by Rob Jenrick as well. And that is where the criticism from within the Conservative Party of Kemi Badenoch comes from, this sort of grassroots movement who thinks she's a kind of soft liberal melt. She's not, she's too woke, she's too Cameroon, which is not the perception in the country at the moment, but that is the perception among the right of the Conservative Party. I mean, I have noticed in conversations with people in Reform that they are aware, or their belief is they have to moderate their language because they have to be able to win Waitrose mums. That's the new target vote. And they think if you start talking about remigration, that is just anathema to the voters they need to take over the Conservative Party. It probably opens up some kind of criticism of him, but at the moment, it doesn't seem like much of a risk to lose that many voters to the right.
So we've got what appears to be a sort of international alliance of right-leaning political leaders, headed by team captain Donald Trump with his sort of number 2, Elon Musk, and perhaps one would say number 3, J.D. Vance, in the US. The critique is, why does Farage care so much about America? I mean, it's constantly said in the House of Commons, he's the MP for Mar-a-Lago, or, nice to see you here, Nigel. When were you last in Clacton, which is what he's elected to represent? That's the sort of the critique, isn't it? That's the line they like to come out with. And I suppose the point they're trying to make is Reform supposed to be a nationalist British party that doesn't care about foreigners and doesn't really care for them that much? Or is it part of some kind of quote-unquote globalist right-wing movement? Do you think that's a fair critique?
I don't really buy it, and I don't think it's that powerful as a critique. I don't think it's ever been that... In some senses, the principal point is that his connection to power, and the most powerful man in the world, is a net positive for Nigel Farage. There's just no way around that. It boosts him as a presence in British politics. It boosts him on the world stage. Look at Keir Starmer walking over crossing the floor of the House of Commons to go and speak to Nigel Farage, to go and have a kind of chummy laugh with him. Everybody knows that Nigel Farage has a better sense of what Donald Trump is thinking on a certain issue than probably the British ambassador to the United States or the foreign secretary or anyone, because he's been there for so long. And that's not to say that David Lammy has not built connections with Donald Trump. He clearly has. But everybody knows that Farage has got close connections, ideological connections, and now we can see it with the pictures. So calling him the MP for Mar-a-Lago, I think, in a sense, boosts him. It is interesting, though, to think about the ideological currents that are at play under the surface here. So on the right, as you were saying, the criticism of Farage is that he's a bit soft now. He's gone soft, mellowed in his old age on these questions. There is also a kind of neo-Powellite movement on the right of British politics, of which...
Powellite, as in Enoch Powell.
As in Enoch Powell. And Nigel Farage, Enoch Powell is a great hero as a youngster. The interesting thing about Powell is he represented something in British politics that's never really happened, which is anti-Americanism. He was a conservative anti-American. He thought that they were the reason for the loss of the British Empire. They were an imperial power that had replaced Britain as an imperial power. They had all of these ideas that were infecting British life that weren't good and should be rejected, and we should be more kind of Gaullist in our attitude. And I don't think that's ever found any real expression in Britain, but it's starting to be picked up by the right, the new right in British politics, that are criticising the Conservative Party, Badenoch and others, but also Nigel Farage. They see America as the place that brought us woke, that kind of infects us with its liberalism, and we should pull back from it. I'm not sure how that's going to play out. I think, in a sense, that might disappear, as it's always disappeared, as they start to see Trump as a kind of ally, and America once again as an ally.
I mean, the degree to which people are prepared to overlook differences or ideological wrinkles in order to get close to these hugely powerful figures can't be exaggerated. And, let's have a quick comparison of their agendas. I mean, we've talked about personalities and campaigning methods, etc., but fundamentally, what does Nigel Farage stand for? He's anti-immigration, or wants what he would call a common sense immigration policy. He is pro roughly free trade, free markets, one thinks. He's certainly Thatcherite in terms of wanting limited government, if anything, a smaller government. And he's pro free speech, certainly because he feels he's been censored, or his ideas have been censored over the years. That sounds not that dissimilar from the Trump-Musk project. I guess you could raise a question on the free markets issue with tariffs and so on, but I mean, I haven't heard Nigel Farage talking about that much. I think in the broad scheme of things, that's a bit of a detail.
I think Farage would just like to get within the American tariff, wouldn't he? I mean, there is something kind of civilizational now about the right, the Farage and Trump right, which is a new thing in geopolitics, I think. 'Cause if you cast your mind back to Thatcherism, Reaganism, when Nigel Farage would have been a Thatcherite and actually Donald Trump was a Democrat, that moment you had a kind of moral distinction in the world in foreign policy in the Cold War. You knew where you knew which side you were on, and the right were cold warriors. They were free traders and cold warriors. But with the decline of the Cold War, the end of the Cold War, that was lost, and so free trade just meant the entire world. But that is now, very few people believe that now. And so that's the other thing that's interesting about this moment. It does feel like the current is kind of flowing with Farage. So right now we're at this moment of Chinese industrial strength, where we may be flooded soon with Chinese steel, Chinese cars, Chinese products that potentially could wipe out the British car industry in one incident.
Thought that happened already.
That happened. Well, no, not yet. It's still to come, I think. But then you combine that with the cheap Chinese imports combined with green policies, industrial policies, net zero essentially. And on both of those issues, you have Nigel Farage looking like he's in a place where the currents are going to pull him to closer to power, if anything, than further away. If we start to see more car factories closing down, or any of the emblematic car factories like Nissan in Sunderland, that only plays into Farage's hands. I can't see how it plays into anybody else's hands at the moment. Mm. And migration. And so almost all of these policies, they look like they are working towards Farage's favour. I mean, I guess the question will be, what is the public perception of Trump's policies on deportations and on tariffs? What is the perception of their success? But right now, you'd have to say that if they start to look successful, that only elevates Farage again.
It's going in his direction. Mm. I mean, that's the perception. And from what we're saying, it seems to be the reality. Mm. All of those sort of policy points, he has picked the side which is going to become increasingly more urgently necessary to take seriously. Mm-hmm. And the fact that you get that Elon Musk picture and such an uncomplicated endorsement. He literally replies on X, his own platform, saying absolutely when Farage posts it and says Britain needs reform UK. It's very rare to get that, and it's just an extraordinary boost. I guess I got to leave this conversation asking what might happen next. I mean, you're our political editor. You read the polls and the runes about what might happen. It seems ridiculous to be talking about this now. We're barely 6 months after a massive, at least massive in the House of Commons, Labour victory. There won't be a general election in the UK for 4.5 years, probably. But what could happen? What do you think we're now looking at as a possible or even likely scenario?
So I think the first thing to say is that the range of possibilities are now much greater than they ever were. So I think that is where it's not inevitable that Nigel Farage is going to win the next election, as is sometimes now claimed. I don't think that is the case, but it's possible, and it wasn't possible before. That is something new. He still has enormous hurdles in the way. I mean, there are...
So just repeat that. So you think it's possible that Nigel Farage wins? As in, what does that mean? Outright majority becomes the governing party.
I think it is possible that Nigel Farage emerges from the next election as Prime Minister. I think that is definitely possible now. Whether that's at the head of a majority government, I still think that is incredibly unlikely. But it's not impossible if you look at the polls now, whether you say that the three main parties, now we talk about the three main parties of Reform, the Labour Party and the Conservative Party are all on roughly 20 to 25%. Now, there's every chance that Reform sort of tip over the Conservative position, which
you see that already in certain opinion polls.
Yeah. Now, some people have said to me, well, that they are from companies that overestimated the Reform's vote in the run-up to the general election. So I think that's that's true. I mean, the essential point is that the first past the post system makes it much, much harder for third parties to break through. It limits the ability to do that. But then at a certain point, it elevates, it sort of accentuates their position if they can cross a threshold. The thing that is different now, though, is that it's not that we have Reform about to take over one party and sort of crush them. That may happen. But you have three parties on the same level that are it's a very shallow support. It's 20 to 25%. It's very hard to know what happens in that. That's kind of chaotic position.
Well, we've just had a general election, if you count the Liberal Democrats in that, as the fourth minor but still significant party. The extraordinary result, which didn't mirror the actual popular vote share, was kind of because of that, wasn't it? Because the votes were thinly spread, it led to this extreme Labour victory. And if you add an increased Reform into that, those kind of distortive effects could be even more visible.
Yeah, and then perhaps the resurrection of the Scottish National Party in Scotland. So you can see a position where Reform take, dozens of seats off the Labour Party in the north. Labour lose seats in Scotland to the SNP. They lose seats to Reform and to Plaid Cymru, the Welsh National Party, Nationalist Party in Wales. And then the Tory party holds its own just in the south. And then you have the Liberal Democrat present. So you have this kind of chaotic system where you have lots of parties and none of them with a majority. Now, I think the interesting question, and this is where you get the Musk money coming in, starts to...
The Musk money, I should say, is not real at this point. The whole idea that Elon Musk is going to give $100 million or pounds to Nigel Farage, I believe first surfaced when Musk's father, who doesn't even talk to him, said it on some kind of cable news show, and suddenly everyone wrote it up as a news story. I don't think that's real. And even Nigel says very emphatically that's not going to happen. But some kind of donation could happen. And this new treasurer they have in the form of Nick Candy, he could very plausibly raise significant funds for them. Yeah, but the 100 million isn't real. So far.
Not yet. But it's interesting that right now you have conservative shadow ministers who don't have special advisors with them because they can't afford to have them. There's just a small example of where the money drying up starts to affect the ability of the Conservative Party to function. And they also they're so small now, 120 MPs, that they're all trying to do multiple jobs to keep the things going. Now they have to bust out of that, and they have to start reaching people, by doing Joe Rogan shows and that kind of thing, just to reach a different new audience. It's just very, very difficult for them. Reform don't have that problem. And if they start getting the money, then they can start building up some kind of momentum ahead of the election. Then we'll see what happens in the polls. Then you add into that the kind of the currents that we're talking about, the geopolitical currents or the economic currents, and you can see something which is potentially problematic. We should just pause there though and say the same reasons why the Conservative Party is struggling to win a majority at the moment, i.e. Reform are winning too many right-wing voters, taking them away from the Conservative Party. That applies in reverse. We shouldn't forget that if the Conservative Party get 20% in the polls, it's very, very difficult for Reform to win an election because they're unlikely to win much more than 25% themselves. And so there are these sort of structural reasons why, if you were to put money on this, you would say, it's still maybe too early for Reform to win. But that's a kind of conventional way of thinking. Things change.
And they're changing very fast. Now, let's end with that note of skepticism. Why not? Because I feel we've been quite up on the possibility that Farage is about to romp home with some kind of coup. Why might we be wrong? Why might we right now represent the bubble, the herd, the getting overly excited just because he posts a picture of Elon Musk or whatever? First of all, we haven't talked much about Kemi Badenoch, the new Conservative leader. She's new, she hasn't done an awful lot yet, but she's charismatic. She herself will be vying for some of that stardust from across the Atlantic. She's already posted pictures of herself with J.D. Vance. Nigel Farage dismisses that completely. I think he said, I've known him for 14 years, she's known him for 14 days, but they're in competition there for those kind of get-togethers. I guess she could get a Trump meeting. She probably will at some point. And Kemi Badenoch is an interesting personality. She's obviously an immigrant. She has, a very interesting story, and she might start getting some attention. So maybe that's one thing that could happen. And maybe there'll be, I'm just riffing here, but maybe there could be scandals. There could be problems with members of Reform. There could be problems with Nigel himself. Who knows? 4 years is a long time.
Yeah.
So if anything, if you're a betting person, mean reversion is also a good principle,
Yes, yeah.
Which is when things are feeling weird, normally they will go back to something more like normal. What do you think? Maybe that's the direction, and we're thinking too much here.
Yeah, I spoke to a pollster just this morning, actually, and he was saying that even if Reform and the Conservative Party got the same proportion of the votes at the next election, and he was quite clear, that would be an extraordinary thing to happen. If they both got, say, 25%, then on the models that he was looking at, Reform would end up with something like 70 seats. So nowhere near...
roughly where the Liberal Democrats are now.
Where the Liberal Democrats are now. This doesn't mean that Nigel Farage won't eventually be Prime Minister either. He's I think he's 60. He's not very old in the grand scheme of things. He can go again in 2034 or 2035. This is what happened with the Labour Party, which Nigel Farage cites as his kind of inspiration for the last third party to break into British politics and overtake one of the two main parties. That happened in the 20s and 30s, and it took a little while before it happened. So that's a scenario, that Nigel Farage still wins, but it takes him a long time. I think the Badenoch thing is interesting because she has got charisma, and she does essentially stand for the same things that you were talking about earlier: free speech, anti-woke, free trade, these kind of things, the smaller state. There's not that much difference on the substantial points. And I think that is quite important, actually. There isn't that much substantive difference between Reform and the Conservative Party at the moment. Now, that does point to something else, a potential pact. Now, this is another thing that catches Westminster's attention. Can you form a pact between the two of them? And that leads to some kind of merger, effectively. I think that this raises the question about Farage himself, which is he the kind of person who can play second fiddle to anyone? Is he going to be Kemi Badenoch's foreign secretary in the next government if he finishes second? Because if he forms a pact, it is essentially accepting that he is not going to beat the Tory party.
And he's done that before, don't forget. Boris Johnson's 2019 victory was in part facilitated by Nigel Farage's party standing down in key seats, because they had this kind of Brexit pact. Mm-hmm. And Farage was convinced that Boris was Brexity enough, and pretty much ushered him into power with that deal. Mm-hmm. He now feels very burnt by that, because the kind of Brexit that Boris Johnson delivered, he didn't think was real, and the rest of it. So I struggle to see that he's going to do that trick again.
But it could be strategically sensible, because if he forms a pact and it guarantees him, or doesn't guarantee, but it gives him a good chance of, say, getting 70 seats in Northern England, where they are lying in second place behind the Labour Party. Now, that's the interesting thing. Reform lie in second place behind the Labour Party in most seats, not the Conservative Party. On the Conservative Party to win, they're lying in second behind the Labour Party as well. So the kind of straight Reform Tory battle, there aren't that many of them. It's one party or the other that's taking over in these seats. So that does point to a strategic alliance. That, though, presents both of them with a conundrum. It presents Farage with a conundrum of accepting that he won't win the election, and it presents the Tory party with a conundrum, which is effectively you've created a powerful third force. You've accepted that they're going to exist. I mean, it's essentially you've created the crocodile that's going to eat you eventually. You kind of know that, and you then have to either merge or you have to enter into some kind of death struggle with them after the next election. But they might see that as worthwhile. But this is sort of what happened in Canada, where you had a party called Reform and the Conservative Party that, were a split on the right, and then eventually the Reform Party and the Conservative Party merges, and they're now back to essentially a Conservative Party. So these things have happened, although not in Britain.
Final example might be Germany, where Merz looks like he's now going to possibly become the new chancellor, having come from, again, a very weak position not very long ago. That he's the rough equivalent of the Conservative Party. If the AfD is roughly the equivalent of Reform over there. And what he did is, tack to the right.
Yeah.
And he started talking very differently about things like immigration. His polling went up, and the need for that protest vote sort of ebbs away. So there are a lot of people trying to advise Kemi Badenoch to do that. Maybe she will.
Yeah, I mean, the other example is Sinn Féin in Ireland, which, they are the populist party, but on the left, and they hit something like 30% in the polls at one point, and then slowly dropped away. So there was another sense of inevitability that existed in Ireland, where Sinn Féin were going to win in Dublin, they were going to win in Belfast, and then United Ireland was coming, and all of those things. And the same sense, history is moving in one direction, and then suddenly it stopped moving in that direction. So a lot will depend on how Kemi Badenoch actually performs as leader. I mean, and it's been a relatively slow start, I think.
A too slow start, perhaps, yes.
I think politics moves so quickly now that she has to start gearing it up.
Tom, thanks for talking this through with us, and thank you for tuning in. It is quite a remarkable thing that literally months after we had a massive Labour victory, massive in terms of numbers of MPs, maybe not vote share, this incredibly talked about powerful person, Elon Musk, the person everyone wants to get in a picture with, everyone wants to have direct connection to, is posing not with Kemi Badenoch, the new leader of the Tory party, nor Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister and leader of the Labour Party. No, he is posing with Nigel Farage and Nick Candy, the new Reform Treasurer. Quite an extraordinary thing. We'll leave you with that image. And for now, this was UnHerd.